Okay, so a very good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome back to the Grand Salon for the last of our conversations for today. Now, this next gentleman I would like to introduce to you is one of the world's leading volcanologists. He is a professor at Uppsala University in Sweden and previously of Trinity College in Dublin. He has a fellowship of the Royal Society of Arts, a fellowship of the Royal Society. Oh, I've messed it up, Valentin. I'm sorry. Please tell me.
It's the Royal Geographical Society.
That's right. That's right. Thank you very much. How embarrassing for me. Right, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome the wonderful Professor Valentin Troll.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's a great pleasure being here. And thank you for coming this afternoon. So I would like to talk about the ancient volcanoes before we actually move on later in our journey towards the active volcanoes in Iceland. But the active volcanoes in Iceland, they have some ancestors, if you will, the grandparents of the Icelandic volcanoes, and they can be found in the British Isles. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. And here's a little content list. We're going to talk about the North Atlantic Igneous province. Some of you may have heard about that, others maybe not, so I'll give you a little introduction to that. And then we're going to go and look at some of the ancient volcanoes of Ireland, and then the ancient ones in Scotland. And we're going to then have a little look at the Proto-Iceland Plume, and I'm going to say a few words about upcoming conversations. So, the North Atlantic is what volcanologists call a large igneous province, a lip. And, well, the definition of lips is a short duration event. And short duration means geologically short duration. This can be 1 million years. So, it's a large event, short-lived, and it produces a lot of magma and therefore lava at the surface. They were emplaced in a situation that is not linked to seafloor spreading or subduction. And what that means to the volcano community is that there is an anomaly. There's a plume that comes from deep inside the earth, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. There's two large igneous provinces I'd like to draw your attention to. That is the Deccan trap basalts in India, and they are held responsible for killing off the dinosaurs. A lot of people will tell you there was a meteorite back in 65 million years before present. It's true, but meteorites are very short-lived events. They don't do quite as much damage as most people think. It's the volcanoes, actually, that really do it. And the North Atlantic Igneous Province is the little red circle higher up. This happened round about the same time, slightly offset from the Deccan traps, and people have speculated that the Scottish volcanoes and the ones in what's nowadays Greenland could have actually played a role there as well. And I'll come back to this a little later. Let me take you back in time. So here we have the younger Earth history, and that goes about 250 million years back to the Triassic. And back in those days, well, that's when the dinosaurs roamed the Earth, and the dinosaurs, they got extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, 65 million years ago. And at that point, we have the Paleocene epoch. And in the Paleocene, we had a huge change. Whenever geologists mark a new era, something bad happened. So, in this case, the dinosaurs got extinct. And just at the end of the Paleocene, at the beginning of the Eocene, we had another event, the Eocene thermal maximum. It's less well known because no large animals died, but literally hundreds of marine species died out. So there was two quick mass extinctions, and we have to think about how they come about. Let me see if I get this in here. Yes, so it's a bit fickle, but just about here you can see 65 million years. So this is where we are at the end of the Cretaceous, and here's 57, that's the Eocene. So we're really talking about this little area here on this time spiral. And of course, nowadays we're at the very end of it. And compared to the entire Earth history, it's still pretty young, but for most of us, 65 million years is pretty ancient. So, let's go into that a little more. In the left-hand diagram, you can see the Earth back in the Permian, and then in the Triassic, and then the third panel there is the Jurassic, and then we go into the Cretaceous, and the lowest one on the left-hand side is the present day. And one big thing that happened during that entire period was the breakup of a supercontinent, Pangaea. Pan, everything, Gea, Earth. So the entire Earth was in one continent. And this continent, it wasn't stable. It didn't last. And it broke up. And when this breakup happened, it changed everything. It opened up the Atlantic. The Atlantic was opening up in the south first, like a zipper. It was going upwards towards the north, and this reached the northern area of our planet at about 65 million years. The right-hand diagram shows the spreading of the ocean, and the colors, the intense colors, they give you an age for this. So Greenland and nowadays Scandinavia and the British Isles, they rifted apart about 60 million years ago, and they have been doing so ever since. What's happening there when oceans started to spread and rifting sets in? Well, this is a process where the Earth breaks apart, plates break apart, new magma rises up, and the volcanoes that ensue from that, they will fill the gap. And if this process continues, this is ongoing now, in this case, for 60 million years in the North Atlantic. And there's a large system of these spreading zones. And the little GIF file down there, it shows how this works. So we have this magma rising up, and it's pushing the plates apart. The Atlantic is spreading very slow. It's about 2 centimeters a year. The Pacific is spreading a lot faster. Pacific is spreading at 7 centimeters a year. And, well, how do we know all this? Because of Iceland. Iceland sits on the spreading center of the Atlantic, and there we can go and see how spreading looks like. And that's how it looks like. Here we see a rift, a breaking apart of tectonic plates. And of course, it's a fracture system that continues for literally hundreds of kilometers. And in Iceland, it is above the water level. Usually, most of these rift centers are below the water. We cannot see them. And we have to ask the question then, why is Iceland so different? So Iceland is built from volcanoes that have, well, been active for about 14 million years. It's a lot younger than the Cretaceous. And the Atlantic spreads at about 2 centimeters a year. Let me give you a flavor of what that means. Your fingernails grow with about 2 centimeters a year. So that's the speed with which the plates move apart. And, well, why is Iceland above sea level and the rest of the rift is not? Well, because there is an extra little feature. Iceland has what geologists call a mantle plume. There's an anomaly of hot material that rises up from deep inside the Earth, and it moves up and it pushes Iceland up. It produces a lot of extra rock, lava, and that's because that's the reason why Iceland is above sea level. So this is a very simple sketch. In reality, it might look a little bit more complicated. Here is a geophysical reconstruction of the Plume stem that feeds Iceland. And here you see it's between Greenland and the British Isles. It's very complicated. It's a bit convoluted, actually. But this is the reason why Iceland is sitting so high above the ocean. Now, this plume has been active for quite some time, literally since the Cretaceous. And this is why we have a connection between Iceland and the old volcanoes in Scotland and Ireland, and also in Greenland. And in fact, there are some on the other side of Greenland as well. There's some in east and some in western Greenland. So Disco Island, for example, is the furthest extent. And the plume sits presently right under Iceland. But back when the Atlantic was together, well, what's nowadays Britain and what's nowadays Greenland, they were actually joined. And the gray colors in the map on the left-hand side, that's all the volcanoes produced by this plume and all the volcanic rocks. And the black ones is where we have surface exposures. And you see in the British Isles in Ireland and the UK, there's a little bit of black. And that goes back to the ancestral Iceland plume. Now, when these plumes come up, and there's a fair number of them, we can talk a little bit more about that later on the cruise. But when these plumes come up, they are hot, and that means they have a buoyancy, they rise up, and then they spread out like a mushroom. And on the right-hand side is an artist's impression, making the Earth mantle transparent. On the left-hand side is an old scientific paper from the 1990s, where people started to realize how these plumes might look like. And then we get volcanoes above this mushroom head. So the region affected by this ancestral Iceland plume was not only elevated in temperature by about 150 degrees C, it was actually about 2,000 kilometers wide, like a large plate that was affected from underneath. And this head of the mantle plume was starting to push through the plates at the beginning, and it was trying to find a way up, and eventually it found some thin spots, some fractures and cracks. And that's where the first volcanoes of that epoch arose. It started about 63 million years ago, so just after the dinosaurs, well, got extinct. And it continues for not quite 10 million years, up to about 52, and likely it happened in 2 pulses. And that will be really important later on, I'll come back to this. So 2 pulses of activity. And the plume is thought to have started in the northwest of this large disk, and then it was moving according to the plate drift. So this is the original diagram from the scientific paper in the late 90s on the left-hand side that shows how the plates may have started to spread apart and break apart and thin out, and then there would have been some thin spots, some fractures and weaknesses, and that's where the original magma came up. And this would have given rise to a string of not only fractures, but actually magma pathways, areas where magma can come up, and that was causing volcanism in the area of the British Isles. So here is, again, a diagram from or a map from a scientific publication, and there's 3 different types of rocks marked here. There's green rocks, that's central complexes, central volcanoes. There is these orangey rocks, these are lava fields, and the black ones, they are fracture intrusions, they're minor fracture fills of magma. So this is the 3 main types of rocks that the volcanism at the time produced. Now let me quickly run you through this. What is the difference here? Well, if you have a fracture, you could have magma coming up along this fissure that forms, and that's what we're seeing right now in Iceland on the Reykjanes Peninsula. This is fissure volcanism. Not a big cone or so of a volcano, but fractures through which magma rises up and becomes lava at the surface. A central volcano is a point source of magma where we have continuous eruptions for a longer time, building up a cone around this point source. So in the British and Irish tertiary igneous province, we have both of those. We have lava fields from fissure eruptions, and we have central volcanoes. And on the right-hand side is different volcano types. We don't have to go into details, but here we see these 2 major types of central volcanoes, and we also have lava fields, and I mark them in their corresponding colors. So this is what we have to expect. Now, having said this, they're deeply eroded in Scotland and Ireland. We don't see complete volcanic systems anymore, but we can reconstruct them partly by looking at Iceland, of course. Now, these fissure eruptions tend to be basaltic. That's a black rock that forms, it's low in silica, it usually flows quite calmly. While the central volcanoes, they tend to be explosive. They produce very different type of magma, high silica magma, and that usually comes with a bang. So here, let me give you a flavor of the difference between them. This is a little video clip from the Eyjafjallajökull eruption 2010 in Iceland. And you see the white cloud in the lower part? That's a fissure eruption, and the big gray one in the back, that's from the central volcano. just a very quick impressions. And here we see these two different types. One is really big explosive, and the big one is the one that caused the air traffic problems back in 2010. And the little one was actually going on for 6 weeks prior to the air traffic problems. It didn't do any damage. And at the moment, the Reykjanes eruptions they are more of the white cloud type, they're of the fissure type, and therefore we had no air traffic problems whatsoever. But the big ones, they are the dangerous ones. And that now brings me to the next part of my presentation here, and that is the old volcanoes in Ireland and in Scotland. And I'm going to start in the southern part, and that means in Ireland. And sorry, it's a bit fickle, as I said. So now we're going to start down here where we have these three little stars. This is in the north of the island of Ireland. It's actually in the border area between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And there we have three volcanoes, three old volcanoes: Carlingford and Slievegullin and the Mournes. Carlingford is actually a Norse name. It means the fjord of Carl. And Slievegullin is an Irish name. And the Mournes is actually, they are named after the previous landowner. So Slievegullin and Carlingford were two large volcanic edifices. And this is this one here. And down there we have Carlingford on the Cooley Peninsula. And then we have the Mourne granites up here. The Slievegullin and Carlingford are of the same age. The Mournes are a little younger, and they were likely simultaneously active. We see this quite frequently, actually, and I have this little picture up there from Indonesia. There we have Semeru volcano and Bromo volcano. Bromo volcano is the shallower one, but they're simultaneously active, and they're very close to each other. And that's what we also see on the Reykjanes Peninsula right now. There we started off at Fagradalsfjall volcano, and now the activity shifted last December to the Svartsengi system, only about 8 kilometers further to the west. So this is what volcanoes do. They may actually have multiple outlets, and that's what I think has been going on there. A few words about them, and I can't spend too much time on each of them. So there are going to be a string of volcanoes I'm going to introduce you to. But Slievegullin, here is a little map on the right-hand side. The yellow is the ring dike of Slievegullin, and the red and green is the central complex. Slievegullin is famous for a huge controversy in geology, and I'll get to this in a minute, but it's also famous for Hugh Cullen's white hair. Well, the story goes that the legendary hero Hugh Cullen, this would have been about the 1st century AD, he was hunting a deer, and he ended up on the hill, on the central hill of Slievegullin. And there is a little lake there. And this is the lake in the top left. And there was a lady sitting there, and she was crying. Hugh Cullen offered his help. "What can I do for you? How can I help you?" And she said, her ring fell into the lake. Well, he offered to retrieve the ring. He jumped into the lake, and he came out as an old man. And it turned out that the lady there was actually a witch. And it was a lady who was very jealous on Hugh Cullen and his love. And so she wanted to make Hugh Cullen look very unappealing. And she succeeded. But Hugh Cullen's friends came back and they captured the witch and said, "Fix this, please." And she did fix it, but the only thing she couldn't fix was the hair color. So this is why Hugh Cullen had white hair. Well, what it really tells us is that this is a somewhat mystical place. And indeed, there is a megalithic burial tomb on top of the hill, and it's just at the very peak of the central hill of Slievegullin. And you can go in there. I did this a few years ago. It's one of the best preserved megalithic tombs because nobody wanted to carry the rocks down the hill. So it's not destroyed. Most of the other burial tombs in the lowlands, they were used for building materials. But I told you there is a big controversy about this. It goes back to the 1950s. Originally, the idea was that ring dikes have to do with calderas. They are material that were filling fractures in a pot, in a caldera, like Yellowstone caldera. But in the 1950s, there was a huge controversy. A lady named Doris Reynolds, she questioned everything, and she questioned this model here by Mr. Ritchie that goes back to the 1930s. And nowadays we're back to Ritchie's model in a way. So here's a few impressions of this. This is Ritchie's old drawings from how the magma chamber in Plaque down there would have actually fed the different eruption pulses. We don't have to go into details, but that's what Slieve Gullion is famous for. The other volcano close by is Carlingford on the Cooley Peninsula, and it's also got some mythical connotation here. It's actually quite important in the cattle raid of Cooley. This is also one of the ancient stories, and I will spare you the details, but well, different tribes in Ireland were competing with each other, and one tribe had this really magnificent bull, and well, it was a thorn in the side of the other tribe, and so they tried to steal the bull, and a whole war ensued over this. And the big battle was fought on the hills of Carlingford. But Carlingford is also geologically famous, and it's geologically famous for a different thing, and that is for cone sheets. Well, what is a cone sheet? If you imagine a cone and you invert it, then it's a sheet intrusion of magma that is like a cone, but in an inverted sense. And the big realization in Carlingford was that there was different pulses of activity. Again, it's a ring center, and we have in green gabbroic rocks, and then a little bit later we had these cone sheets cutting these gabbroic rocks. And one of the famous geologists of the 1950s and 60s, Michael Abar, he realized that if we have these cone sheets shown here in black, they would actually imply that there was pushing from underneath. When we see cone sheets, it implies there was a push from underneath. So wherever geologists now see cone sheets, and I'm showing one example here from the coast at Carlingford in the top right, whenever we see that, we know the volcano was pushing upwards, while ring dikes are actually implying that something collapsed into the volcano. So once you see the orientation of these minor intrusions, you can actually work out what happened at the volcano. A quick word about the Mournes. The Mournes are younger, as I said, than the other two Irish volcanoes. They're mainly granitic, so they're high silica. Likely they were feeding some big eruptions, explosions potentially, but we have no evidence in the rock record for that. But they're famous for their beautiful granite trails, and there was also a big controversy recently about how these granites were emplaced. Well, the original model was the ring dike model, as shown in the bottom right-hand side here. Then a young researcher from the University of Birmingham, he claimed that this was all entirely wrong. And, well, the latest paper I wrote 2 years ago said, well, the man from Birmingham may have been wrong. So it's open for debate. I actually think the ring dike model is still a good one. The other famous thing about the Mourne Mountains is it's one of the type localities for what we call magma mixing. There we see two types of magma. We see the black basaltic magma, and we see the granitic reddish or grayish material there. And here, like in a lava lamp, we have blobs of one in the other. So these were two different types of magmas, and they didn't properly mix, they didn't blend completely, so we can still see the individual components. And this is an exposure at the shore where we see blobs of one in the other, and they didn't really blend entirely. So having discussed this, I'd like to move a little bit further to the north. We've been just down in the bottom right of the right-hand panel here, and now the big pink area in that same diagram, that's the Antrim lavas. This is actually the largest lava field in the area. And here we see the Ulster white limestone overlain by these lavas. The Ulster white limestone is exactly the same as the Dover Cliffs limestone. It's of course named differently because people in Ulster couldn't name it the Dover limestones. So here we have this massive package of lava sitting on top of this, literally hundreds of meters thick. The most famous part of the lava field is the Giant's Causeway. So here we have the Giant's Causeway, and again, it's got its own claim to fame because of these beautiful basaltic columns. Well, how do those form? Well, the idea is that if you have lava, it's liquid. When it cools, it contracts. Like in a mud pool that dries up, you get these polygonal cracks, and that's what we see here, only that they extend laterally. So in that sense, we have the Giant's Causeway, and the Giant's Causeway has been really, really famous for quite some time as a tourist attraction back in the old days. And of course, also geologists liked it because of these columns. It explains how lava cools. It's also famous for the distillery close by, and they claim that their water is particularly unique because it goes through the rocks of the Giant's Causeway. Well, when I was still in Dublin, I took students there, and this was always the highlight of the day, as you can imagine. So another aspect is that, well, why is it called the Giant's Causeway? Well, there's this story about the two giants. And there was an Irish giant and a Scottish giant. And you know, giants are not so smart. That's why we don't have them anymore around. And the Irish giant, he could see the Scottish giant on the other side, and he thought, he's a small fella. So he built that causeway in order to show him who's the bigger giant. And the closer he got, the more he realized the Scottish giant is actually not as small. So eventually he decided, I better not risk the fight. But at that point, the Scottish giant had seen him, and he runs after him. And the Irish giant speeds up, goes home, and he realizes he can actually not win that fight. So he tells his wife, please, dress me up as a baby. And so his wife dresses him up as a baby. The Scottish giant arrives, and the wife of the Irish giant says, my husband isn't at home. I'm here alone with the baby. And of course, the Scottish giant says, that's the baby. How big must the father be? And then the Scottish one runs back and destroys the causeway after him and thinks, my God, this Irish giant. So anyway, the story is that they never really had a fight, and they kind of fooled each other a little bit. But, well, there is the causeway, the remains, the bridgehead, if you will, and the equivalent of that bridgehead in Scotland is Staffa, close to Mull. It's also a lava field, but it's completely unrelated in terms of the eruption. It's a different volcano, but it looks very similar, and hence this concept of the two coming together. So let me move further north. Now it's time to go to Scotland. We're looking at the Isle of Arran, which we're going to pass as well. I don't want to spend too much time there, but there's two volcanoes there, the Northern Arran Granite and the Central Arran Ring Complex. The Central Ring Complex is in the little map. It's the green area, and the granite is the pink area. There is a reconstruction in the bottom right of the central complex. And the granite is quite famous because it's one of the nicest, roundest granite bodies we have. And this is an old map. This is a somewhat younger map. There's different facies of granite. Again, this is details for geologists, but it also makes beautiful landscapes, and it actually produces a lot of very fresh water. And a little bit further south, connected to it, we have another famous rock on the Isle of Arran. That's the Dramadoon Cliffs. And that's also a volcanic intrusion. Here you see these beautiful cliffs with a columnar jointing as well. On the map, on the left in red is the rocks. Well, there's two important things about the Dramadoon, or the dune as we call it. And that is, well, it's actually shown on the Dramadoon Point whiskey, which is quite exclusive. And, well, there's a famous golf course right next to it as well. So, in my quick review of the Irish and Scottish volcanoes, we'll move on to Mull and Ardnamurchan. And again, there's a lot of whiskey there. And of course, the distilleries claim that the rocks are fundamental because they give the water a particular flavor. So here we have a Mull whiskey, and maybe you have an opportunity to try that if you like. So let's start with Ardnamurchan, another ring complex, again, geologically really famous. But first of all, a few words about Mull. So the Isle of Mull, where we're going to go, has a big volcanic system with three centers that were migrating in time. And back in the day, the geologists of the British Geological Survey, they were paid by the number of rock types they would describe. So this led to a complete inflation of rock types. And here we have the three centers taken apart. And again, I beg you not to go into detail, because part of it is that there is just one tiny little difference, say one new mineral in a rock, and it would be a new rock type, so that the geologists get paid more. And in a geological sense, we have these three centers, and that means three stages of the volcano: an early, a middle, and a late stage. The map on the right-hand side is center 3, and center 3 is something I'm personally very interested in. Here we have probably the best ring dike in the world, the Loch Ba ring dike. Loch Ba means the lake of the cows, and actually you have to walk through a lot of cow pies in order to get there. But eventually you get there, and it's also a mixed magma, but it's got these wonderful schlieren textures, these streaks of one magma in the other. And well, how do ring dikes form? You have a magma reservoir, the roof caves in, and it squeezes out the magma to the surface, often in explosive fashion. So that's a particular geological highlight of Mull. Ardnamurchan, as I said, well, you look at the map in the top, and this is one of the maps from the 30s, and you can see the vast sheer mound of rock types that were described there, because people wanted to be paid. And I think it's a little over the top. People have simplified this now. Another feature there is a lot of cone sheets. The sketch in the bottom and the photos on the right give you a flavor here. So this is the different rock types, a little bit simplified. I'm going to go even further. It's yet further simplified into several centers. We have center 1, 2, 3. They were also shifting geographically, but a very similar feature or very similar history to the volcano of Mull. Now, the next one is yet higher up, the island of Rum. It's also known as the Forbidden Isle, and it's forbidden in the sense that up to the 1950s it was privately owned, and the owners did not allow people to go onto the island because it was a hunting estate for the Bullocks. The Bullocks was an industrial family from the north of England, and the Bullocks got really rich with all sorts of industries, and eventually they were actually getting a little baronet title as well, and they had so much money. They built that castle. It's Edwardian. It's very young. It's actually built in 1902, I think, and you couldn't really go there. Rum, the name is Norse. It comes from Rumoi, so Vikings have been there, and of course it's a volcano. And it's particularly famous for the layered rocks of central Rum. The layered rocks are the bottom of a magma chamber. So here we have the rocks from the sea, and there is the hill of Askeval and Hallival, and there we can actually look into the old volcano. We have the roof rocks as well. That's Benin and Stack, the hill of Benin and Stack, and there you can actually see the top of a magma chamber. Geologically, extremely fascinating. You can literally walk inside a volcano, believe it or not. And what you see inside a volcano is quite revealing. You actually see sediments, hot sediments. A lot of the crystals that were forming inside the magma were raining down to the bottom of the magma chamber, and there, in succession with many pulses of replenishment, there we now have these layered rocks. And this is really shaping the view of how we look at volcanoes today. Active volcanoes, we can't go down into the magma reservoir, but we know from these Scottish volcanoes how it should look like. And actually, I think that many of the Icelandic volcanoes look exactly like that. So here's a cross-section. Geologists love to do cross-sections. They cut through the rocks, and there we see these different layers, 16 exposed layers, and there's one of my students admiring one of the layers, and there we have the old roof rocks, which comes from an earlier volcanic episode of the same volcano. Now, how deep do these things continue downwards? Well, we don't know. But you can do geophysics, you can measure the gravity of the rocks, and if you do that, then the magma reservoir may continue down for several kilometers, depending on what model you want to use. Here, one of the models, the one on the right-hand side, would suggest that the magma reservoir continues for 14 kilometers. Quite a big volcano. And one of my PhD students, he drew that little sketch, and the red dotted line is the present-day land surface. And we had this magma chamber with the layers, and there must have been a big volcano above. we don't see much of this volcano anymore. The island of Rum is also famous for the Long Loch fault. The Long Loch, well, it sits in a fault, so it's pretty long, and it marks the fault trace, and here we see the geological map draped over the topography, and there's this feature that cuts the island almost in half. That's the Long Loch fault. It almost looks like in Iceland. There you have fractures that rift things apart, and the rocks around this area are intensely broken up. And here's some impressions of broken up rocks in the fault zone and bits that were falling in, and quite a messy thing. And it tells you that volcanoes, deep inside the bowels of volcanoes, there's a lot of activity. Rocks break. That's why we get earthquakes. And rocks get deposited. They fall off the sidewalls of magma chambers, and they get laid down. And this is how volcanoes may partly build their way upwards. So this is how we think this magma chamber might have looked like, and with each movement of the fault, new magma may have risen up, like we think it's happening right now on the Reykjanes. So in the hillsides it looks like this. This is the Long Loch, and the fault is marked with a red trace. And the most important hill in this sequence is this one here. It's Trolloval. And Trolloval, well, my students always ask, is it named after you? Because my nickname is Val, and my surname is Troll. And of course I say, yes, absolutely. Which is of course not true, it's a Norse name. And it's the mountains of the Trolls. Now, I couldn't resist, I had to study it. So I went up there, Trolloval, home of the Trolls. There you can see me attempting to hike up, and I did achieve the hike. So there you see myself on the peak. And it's a little bit of a climb, but it's quite pleasant. And well, I asked myself for a long time, why is it called Trolloval? There is no trolls apart from myself. And it's actually because of this bird, the Manx shearwater. It's nocturnal, and they make a lot of noise at night. And the Vikings, who had day camps there on the island, they used it for navigation. They got very scared. They didn't go much inland, so they just heard all these weird noises up there from the mountain. And Trolloval is actually a breeding ground for the Manx shearwater. So the last volcano I'm going to introduce you to is the island of Skye. Skye is magnificent, and on the right-hand map, it's the topmost of the volcanoes. It's got a central complex and a lava field. It's got it all. And it's also the youngest of them, because I said earlier it was like a zipper going upwards. So this is the youngest of the family of Scottish and Irish volcanoes. And here we have the central complex. Very complicated rock arrangements here in the core of the island. There's granites, but also the mafic, the, well, dark equivalent of granites. It's called gabbro. And of course, there's a distillery. Let me show you. Here it is. So, and it's the Talisker distillery, and they claim that the gabbro rock of the Western Coolins makes their whiskey particularly good. And it's also a very peaty whiskey, so maybe you have an opportunity to try it. And this is unique to the island of Skye. And again, it's claimed to be a volcanic whiskey because of that. So there's something else about Skye. And actually, Skye has been instrumental, not because of the rocks on Skye, but because of the rocks on some of the other islands. The picture on the right-hand side is from the tiny island of Egg. Egg is some 40 kilometers away from Skye, and it's got that strange mountain that sticks up. That's the Sgurr of Egg. And the Sgurr of Egg is actually of a completely different composition to the rest of Egg. The Sgurr of Egg is actually of a composition that fits Skye. And that leads geologists to think that this was an eruption that must have happened on Skye, and it must have been so vast that material was produced and was moved in explosive, glowing avalanche all the way to what's nowadays Egg. In addition to that, there is a tiny little rock on the other side of Rum, and that's called Oiksgur, and it's got the same rock again. So, if we then play this game that geologists love, you connect rocks of different locations but same composition, then it looks like this. There was a big eruption at about Marsco on the Isle of Skye, where we have the same rocks. And then we have Muck and Egg in the right-hand pink area. And then there's Oiksker on the other side of Rum. And if you link that up, you actually come to the conclusion there must have been a really enormous, explosive eruption. And it must have been so big that it would have changed the climate. So we wrote a paper about this, and for those of you interested, I have a few, maybe somewhat academic papers lying there. Feel free to take a copy if you like. But we said that in one of the scientific papers. It was picked up widely in the media about Skye volcanic eruption changing the climate, but of course, only 57 million years ago. And this was a big realization. So this brings me to the end of my little volcano review in Ireland and Scotland, and I'll say a few concluding words now. And that is, back when this happened, when the Plume, the proto-Iceland plume came up, was feeding these, we had two different phases of volcanism, as I said. Phase 1 was about 62 to 58 million years, and it was feeding material through cracks. And the second phase was when the plates had properly split. There we had bigger volumes of magmatism, and that was about 57, 56 million years ago. That's all good and well, but today we're facing potentially some serious climate troubles, and let's look at this diagram here. This is millions of years before present, and we're at 65 million years on the very left, and we're at present day on the very right. And what you see very quickly is back in the Paleocene and the Eocene, when the Irish and Scottish volcanoes were active, we had two major peaks of hothouse climate. Much, much hotter than it is today. If things continue, so some people claimed, if we pump more CO2 in the atmosphere, we may actually reach a hothouse again. That's the big concern right now, and there's different projections on the far right-hand side, and some of these projections reach into this red area. And this is what led scientists over the last few years to say, if we really want to understand what might happen with our climate, we can look back to the periods back in the Eocene and the Paleocene. So this is a work by Gerta Keller. She's a professor in the US, and she made this comparison. Again, I don't want to go into details, but on the left-hand side, with the red arrow, we have the Paleocene hothouse environment, and she drew a little meteorite there to kind of give the meteorite proponents also a little bit of, yeah, you know. So, but I think it's the volcanoes, not the meteorites. And then the second period in the Eocene thermal maximum was even hotter, and there's no meteorite. So it was the volcanoes. And then it all cooled down, and nowadays we are producing a lot of CO2, and as I said, some people argue it could actually get bad. And the right-hand diagram in the top row is the present day, and Professor Keller, she argues that if we really want to get a sense of how things were, or how things might be in the future, we could actually look at the Eocene thermal maximum. This would be very similar to what we might be in for. Well, during the Eocene thermal maximum, we had palm trees growing at the North Pole. So, but let's wrap up now. The 65 million year Paleocene hothouse, well, that's likely causing the demise of the dinosaurs, mostly the Deccan traps in India. But did the Scottish volcanoes and the Irish ones contribute? I think so. Maybe not as a major player, but they were more than mere bystanders. So these volcanoes we're going to see, they had a hand in this. But when we think about the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which was 100,000 years of extreme heat with palm trees at the North Pole, that's where the Irish and Scottish volcanoes are really to blame for. So I thank you for your attention. And I would like to point out there will be more lectures. The next one will be on volcanic hazards. Then there will be a lecture on the geology of Iceland and the volcanology. And then another one on the recent eruptions in Iceland. And the last one, I'll tell you later. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. It was a great pleasure to be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Valentin Troll.